everyone, thanks for joining us today on URM's webinar, where we're going to discuss how to get the most from your pen test program. My name is Lauren Gotting and I am the new business manager here at URM, and I'm joined today by Junwoo Lee, who is URM's head of cyber testing services. Quick run through the agenda for today's session. So we'll start off with some introductions, and then we will run through some types of pen tests that you may have conducted already or may be looking into. We'll also run through what URM as a pen testing organisation comes across a lot in terms of pen testing and the vulnerabilities found. We'll also talk a little bit about the role of vulnerability scanning and cover off the pitfalls to avoid when running pen tests and things to keep an eye out for. And then we'll finish the session by talking about some things that you can do, that you can implement, that just support sort of your cybersecurity program and pen testing plans, really. So if I give everyone an introduction on URM. So we've been in business for nearly 20 years now and has a number of experts in the world of sort of ISO standards, security frameworks like PCI DSS, and probably most importantly for today's session, cyber security services as well. So we are a Cyber Essentials and Cyber Essentials Plus certification body, as well as a CREST accredited penetration test organisation. Here at URM, we have sort of GRC consultants, so very, paperwork, policy, process driven, and alongside that, we then have the technical expertise of our cyber team as well. And I'd say everyone that works at URM really wants to work with clients to make them secure. There's a lot of passion within the team, and we want, businesses and clients to achieve their goals, whatever they may be. Alongside that, so I'm proud to be associated with the NCSC, and we are a cyber incident exercising service provider and also a member of the Cyber Advisor Scheme, which relates to Cyber Essentials. And I'll hand over to Jun, who can tell you a little bit more about himself.
Yes, hello everyone. So I'm Junwoo, and I'm the head of cybersecurity testing here at URM. So I'm involved with anything related to penetration testing, technical security assessment within URM. I've been involved with information security since 2010, and I have obtained a bunch of security certification related to penetration testing, offensive security, red teaming, etc.
Brilliant. Thanks, Jun. So first things first, just talk very briefly about sort of the different types of pen tests that organizations can have completed.
Yes, so typically when we talk about penetration testing, there's a wide variety of tests that we can perform and that the companies typically look for, and these are summarized in this slide, which are the most common ones we see. So those are external and internal infrastructure penetration testing, wireless network penetration testing, web applications, APIs penetration testing, mobile application testing, social engineering such as physical social engineering or phishing attacks, cloud security, security and configuration review, including container and orchestration technologies reviews, build reviews of servers, workstations, and even source code reviews of web or mobile applications.
Thanks, Jun. So I speak to a lot of organizations that are moving away from sort of traditional infrastructure setups with technology and things. So what would be most applicable in those scenarios in terms of a type of test that would bring benefit to a business?
Yeah, so I mean, if they don't have any traditional type of infrastructure, I suppose you mean they use a lot of cloud-based infrastructure services, both in terms of infrastructure as a service or software as a service. So definitely a review of their security posture of their cloud environments would be something that we can recommend, but also because they probably use end user devices, a review of the security of their workstations or mobile devices is something, or the MDM policies they use to protect their devices, that can be something they can do, which can provide some value for those kind of organizations.
Yeah. So security can still be looked at then in those cases.
Yes, definitely. Yeah,
absolutely. Brilliant. So what we'll dive into now is some of the most common vulnerabilities that Jun and the team find, and what it really means, I suppose. What are the real risks of those vulnerabilities being found during testing?
Yeah, so basically, to prepare for this webinar, we've extracted data and analyzed it about the vulnerabilities we've raised during our pen test in the last year or so. And we've prepared a list of, let's say, the top 10, 11 vulnerabilities that we've raised during our test. And we've seen that due to the market size and the number of tests we do in this area, the most common vulnerabilities are identified within the web and the external and infrastructure penetration tests. The first, let's say, and probably the one where we've raised the more findings in the last year, relates to patching, so out of date and unsupported software being in use throughout the organization. And this is applicable both for the infrastructure side, so both on the external, internal infrastructure, and on the web application side. And it involves things like, using unsupported operating system, missing security patches on both software that servers use or clients use in terms of browsers, but also in web applications. It involves things like JavaScript frameworks or that they use for the front end, but also the web server technologies or the language that they use.
Obviously, looking at this slide, there's quite a lot to keep an eye on. Is there anything out there where people can keep an eye on what's out of support and what's not supported or getting security patches anymore?
Yeah, I mean, to help organizations to, let's say, with their patching and everything, we have some recommendation, obviously, for all these vulnerabilities at the end of the slides. But in this case, I would say, first of all, we'll be having an asset register of whatever you have in terms of software, both in terms of operating system and applications that you have. Having some patch management tools that can help you centrally manage this patching, because obviously doing every machine manually becomes difficult. Performing regular vulnerability scans and assessments, which will help you obviously identify those issues sooner rather than later. So all those things together can help you keep up with all the patching that you have.
I can imagine for some organizations, they probably have a lot of this and it must take some time.
Yes, yeah, it's not an easy task, otherwise it wouldn't be the top, one of the top vulnerabilities we find every test.
Absolutely. Brilliant. So what are the biggest risks, I suppose, for the out-of-date software and unsupported software?
Yeah, so because it's obviously such a wide issue, it really depends on the vulnerability affecting the vulnerable software, the out-of-date software, or the unsupported software. So the risk can be anything from remote code execution to denial of service to information disclosure. But and for unsupported software is obviously the fact that because it's unsupported by the vendor, even if a publicly known vulnerability is disclosed and it's known, the fix will not be applied because the vendor is not supporting the software anymore. So the risk is that you're not going to be protected even if publicly known vulnerabilities will be identified on those softwares.
Brilliant, thank you, Jun. And I think another one just worth mentioning, if anyone's going through the process or has Cyber Essentials, Cyber Essentials Plus, it's a big no-no. Hey, it's an automatic fail for both of those certifications, which just tells you how important it really is. Hey, if that's the essentials.
Yes, definitely. So having an unsupported software or operating system, it's an immediate fail for certification like the Cyber Essentials or the Cyber Essentials Plus. So it's one of the main thing for that certification. So yeah, it highlights how important it is.
Brilliant. Thanks, Jun. Okay, on to the next one.
Yeah, so the next one relates to TLS, SSL configuration and certificates weaknesses, which basically is related to the encryption of the data that you transmit to and from different services when you communicate through a network. And it involves both infrastructure, both in external and internal infrastructures, and web applications. And what we see is the use of weak ciphers or protocols, and or using weak certificates. And obviously the risk is that the reason why you're implementing these certificates and this encryption fails, and attackers may be able to then decrypt the data and obtain sensitive information that you're transmitting. So that's the main risk about that.
Want to be careful with that one.
Yeah.
Thanks, John. Okay, default or weak passwords. This one really surprises me that this is a common finding.
Yeah, it is, but it's still one of the main findings we identify during external, internal pen tests, but also web applications. And I guess sometimes it's linked to the fact that some services are considered to be less critical, such as printers or scanners, and people try to overlook some type of devices or services, and that leads to us, or in the worst case, threat actors being able to find those. And as we talked about Cyber Essentials, this is also one of the areas that are considered to be essential security measures. And if you have default passwords, that's going to be also like a fail for Cyber Essential Plus. And obviously, the risk is that if you have weak password, people are going to be able to guess it and gain access to the services you're trying to protect.
Okay. I often hear organizations implementing password policies, and there's some tech that can support, password policies. How does that, how do people sort of essentially break that and sort of go outside the rules?
I mean, it's difficult to set a policy that can cover everything. So obviously people, even if you set a password policy saying you need to have 12 characters as a minimum, people may be able to set their password as password 1 2 3 4 5 6, and that would be compliant with the policy, but it's probably not a very strong policy. So to complement that, we typically recommend to complement the policy with a deny list, for example, of common passwords, including your, for example, your company name, or words like password, secret, let me in, or this, or the April, the month or the year. But also with some training to the employees, and provide them guidance that it's easy to implement, such as, NCSC, for example, recommends the 3 random words guideline, where you think about 3 random words like table, sky, and rainbow, and or a passphrase like today I went to the shop and I like buying bread. So those kind of passwords are easy to make them very long, which makes them difficult to crack or to brute force. So that would be, and together with that, if you allow them to, if you provide them the technical means such as password managers, that's going to help them as well manage their password in a more secure way and have more complex password, and add MFA on top of that, and that's going to make an even better solution.
Yeah, it can be a nightmare remembering passwords sometimes.
Yes, definitely. Yeah.
And with sort of passwords now, I think there's been a historic debate with passwords and changing passwords. How often, what's the next guidance on how often people should be changing their passwords?
So currently, if you go by the NCSC recommendation, the recommendation is to not enforce regular password changes. So and that's what we also recommend. So don't enforce 30 days, 60 days, 90 days password changes, because it's been studied that that doesn't really achieve much, because people are going to use slight variation of the previous password, etc. And if a password gets breached, that's going to be used immediately, not after 90 days anyway. So the recommendation at the moment is not to enforce regular password changes, but to use other means to protect your authentication, such as MFA, complexity, etc.
Brilliant. All right, thanks, Jim. So the next common vulnerability that we're finding.
Yeah, so the next one is the use of the exposure of administrative or unnecessary services, which goes against the principle of, let's say, least privilege, or so it's something that basically increases your attack surface unnecessarily. And we find it both on external, internal infrastructure, and also on web applications. So for example, we see sometimes services like RDP, SNMP, database ports exposed to the internet, but also login pages for the CMS, the content management system of certain websites like WordPress being exposed to the internet. But we see that very often also on internal networks, probably because organization thinks you first need to be in the internal network. So you think you're more protected. And we see a lot of services like Tomcat Manager or Printer, administrative portals being accessible from anyone within the internal network. And obviously that gives threat actors the opportunity to then attack those services, brute force them, exploit any vulnerability affecting those services to gain unauthorized access to those services unnecessarily, because if you don't need to expose those, you don't need to, if users don't need those, you don't need to expose those.
Yeah, so the key takeaway there is just to keep everything as locked down and as small as you can. Really,
yeah, I guess one term that now is quite commonly used is attack surface management. So if you try to lower your attack surface, that's going to be obviously they will put you in a better security posture.
Brilliant, very useful. Thanks, Jim. So insufficient brute force protection. Now, I think I know what this is, but can you just confirm what exactly is brute force?
Yeah, so brute forcing is a technique that attackers use to gain access to unauthorized access to certain services when there is a login. So what brute forcing is basically using multiple, like hundreds, thousands, millions, if you want, of passwords and attempting them against a login page until you guess the right one. So if you have a login page, you know, for example, a username, and then you try an infinite number of passwords until you get the right one.
And Jim, from a tester's perspective, so now in my mind, I'm picturing someone typing in, password 1, password 2. Do you use tools to speed this process up?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, of course. We use automation because the number of passwords we typically try is too high to be able to perform that manually. So we use automation tools that help you try hundreds or even thousands of passwords per minute, so that we can go through like big word list that we can also generate for our clients, and try those passwords in an automated way and identify if any of those passwords get a hit. So insufficient brute force means that attackers then can attempt these brute force attacks without either being delayed with like login throttling, where you need to wait to a certain amount of time before you attempt the next password, or without having any lockout, where the account, even if you provide the right password after 100 attempts, it will not work because the account has been locked out. Or the best thing as well is multi-factor authentication again, which is still unfortunately not widely adopted by everyone. But obviously, even if you guess a password, you still need a second factor of authentication to get access to the service you're trying to breach. So yeah, obviously the risk is quite obvious. You basically allow attackers to attempt that brute forcing attacks, and obviously to get access to private data and services. Yeah,
could be major, couldn't it, if that actually happened? And one thing that jumps out to me here is the MFA being not widely adopted. Is it quite onerous to implement MFA?
I mean, typically not. Technically, it shouldn't be too onerous. Obviously, there are some services that put MFA behind a paywall, so you may have to, depending on the service you're using, maybe you have to pay a premium to enable MFA. And the other thing could be, obviously, the classic problem of change management. People may resist against any change within an organization, so you obviously have to manage users and get them on board. But yeah, technically, it shouldn't be something too onerous to implement, and obviously the benefits will highly be bigger than the cost.
Yeah, it's definitely increasing. My mobile phone always seems to be dead when I have to confirm who I am with MFA. So it's definitely reaching out there. Brilliant.
Yeah.
So what are the next vulnerabilities, Jim? Can you tell us a little bit more about the clear text protocols?
Yes, of course. So yeah, so this is something that we also find again on external, internal infrastructure, and also web application. And it basically means that we still find protocols that transmit data unencrypted, which means that anyone being able to intercept the traffic is able to see what you send to the server and what the server sends you back. So if you transmit any sensitive information like credentials when you log in, or data that is part of our web application where you have account details or anything that you would like to protect, that's going to be accessible by anyone who is performing a man-in-the-middle attack. So obviously there is a high risk of confidentiality, but also integrity being breached, because if anything gets modified between the communication, you won't be able to notice it.
It could be a pretty big problem for some businesses.
Yeah, definitely, yeah.
Brilliant. And SMB signing not enforced. Can you tell us a little bit more about this one?
So, so this is a typical finding we identify within internal networks, because typically it's not exposed on the external, and we find SMB signing being enabled but not enforced, which means that even if you try to send unsigned requests to the SMB server, that's going to be accepted because it's not forced. And it pairs well with the next vulnerability we're going to show later. But basically, what the main risk attached to it is that if you are able to perform a man-in-the-middle attack in an internal network, you typically are able to obtain what are called NTLM version 2 hashes, which are basically credential password hashes of users within your internal network, and those will be able to be relayed to these SMB servers that don't enforce SMB signing, because again they're not signed. So and that in practice, from a business perspective, what does it mean? It means that if I relay a credential from user A to this server, and this server typically can be a file server, I'm going to be able to access all the files that user A is typically allowed to access. And if user A has a lot of access to that file share, I'm going to be able to dump a lot of that information. Even worse, if the user being relayed is an administrator, local administrator of that SMB, of their machine hosting the SMB file server, I'm going to be able to get command execution and basically fully compromise the whole server.
So they'll be in and they'll go wild.
So you basically have full control of the machine in that case.
Being a common finding, what surprises me is that it's often enabled but not enforced. So my question really is, why is it not enforced, and how do businesses enforce it?
Well, so enforcing is basically a configuration change, and obviously in Windows you can configure it via group policies, but basically there is a settings that you can set to always enforce SMB signing, and in that case, if you relay something to that server, it's going to say no because the signature is wrong, it's not sent by you. Why is it not widely adopted? I guess it's because main reason is probably because by default it's not set as to enforce, and probably the reason why it's not set as default is because it may have breaking, it can be a breaking change in some environments where it is not possible to only accept signed SMB requests. So yeah, that's the main reason.
So it could cause problems. It could cause problems.
Potentially, yes. I mean, the more probably nowadays there's less and less reason why you should not be able to. But obviously, every organization should test it before obviously having any disruptions in their network.
Yeah, so tricky just trying to get the balance right, isn't it, for that, really? Okay, so this page has I've seen a lot of letters, Jim. Can you tell us a little bit more about what this all means, please?
Yeah, so I mean, I'm not gonna go into the specific, it's in the slide, so yeah, what the names are, but they are basically name resolution protocols, and they're legacy protocols, which means they're old and they're now not really necessary in most of the organizations. And name resolution protocols, what they do is translate host, let's say, easy to remember host names such as database server dot myorganization dot local into an IP address. And that's because the IP address is then needed by computers and systems to communicate with each other. And these legacy protocols are known to be, let's say, insecure, because attackers can abuse these protocols to resolve these names with the IP address they want. And that means that attackers can perform man-in-the-middle attacks, meaning that all the traffic that they want will be redirected through the attacker's machine and then sent to where it needs to go. So attackers basically have visibility of all the traffic that goes into the network. And as I said before, this vulnerability is often used in conjunction with the previous one, where SMB signing is not enforced, because when performing this kind of attacks, threat actors can gather these NTLM version 2 hashes, which are password hashes, and relay them to SMB servers and gain access to, as I said, files stored on there, or if there are admins, get command execution as well on those machines and fully compromise them.
So it could be catastrophic then, really.
Yeah, it's
together.
Yeah, it basically allows an attacker from being in the network with no credential and no access at all to potentially being administrator on a machine.
Cool. Right. Okay. Unrestricted file uploads.
Yeah. So this is it's a common finding we find on web application during web application penetration test, when the application allows you to upload files, such as sometimes you have your change your profile image or update your documents, send us some documents or upload your CV. But if there's no control of what files are being uploaded on the server, that can have huge impacts depending on different circumstances. And in some of the worst cases, it can lead to code execution on the server itself, or in malware distribution, because you can upload a file that somebody else then downloads. It can cause obviously denial of service. For example, if you don't check, if a file, the file size being uploaded, you can start to upload gigabytes of data and exhaust system resources.
So am I right thinking organizations can build these controls in? So if I'm developing a portal and I'm writing code, for a portal, I can put these checks in there and then?
Yeah, of course, you should put those checks in. Like any other user input, file uploads is yet another input that comes from users, and anything coming from users should be validated and sanitized and processed in a secure way, so that you only receive what you're expected to receive and nothing else, and everything else is discarded or modified or processed in the correct way.
Okay, brilliant. I had a question come in from an attendee on this slide specifically. So I think basically alluding that they use portals but not their own developed portals. So how can they be sure that file uploads are secure?
Well, obviously, if you're not developing the application yourself and it's a third-party one, you should get all the necessary assurance from the vendor that the product you're subscribing to or you're buying is secure. So you can ask the vendor to provide, for example, a pen test report about that was performed on their portal, provide any certification they can have, or sometimes you can also ask them if you can perform a pen test on the instance they provide to you, and that may also be a solution. But yeah, definitely you should ask assurance to your vendor that what they're selling and providing to you is secure also in this case.
Brilliant. Thanks, Jim.
Yeah.
Okay. So Can you tell us a little bit more about injection attacks, which I hear the word quite a lot, when talking to the team. So can you give us a bit more of an insight to this one?
Yeah, so this is another vulnerability that we often see in web applications, and I've basically grouped a few different types of vulnerabilities in here. As you can see, we have cross-site scripting, SQL injection, XML injections, and those are type of attacks where users input something, and that something is typically not something the application expects. So special characters or commands that then will be used by the application to do something that it was not expected. So there are a few risks in that, which can go from the full compromise of the application. For example, SQL injections, if you were to do that, you could get all the data from the database. Cross-site scripting, you could run scripts on other application users, etc. So it can have serious consequences.
I want to watch out for.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Cheers, Jen. Okay, can you tell us a little bit more about this slide, please?
Yeah, so this is again something related to web applications, where it's basically a big category where that summarizes issues when the application doesn't check that the user requesting a certain resource has the privileges to request that and and provide that resource. Some simple examples is the IDOR, so indirect direct object references, where you can then request resource 1 to 3, while when you are, for example, user 1 to 3, and you get that. But if you request 1 to 4, the application say, well, you're not that person, you shouldn't be able to access that data. But if there is not enough checks, you will be able to retrieve that. So that can lead to obviously horizontal privilege escalation, and in some cases to vertical privilege escalation, and gain, you may be able to gain access to functionalities as well that you shouldn't be able to access. Okay. And yeah, so those are the main the risks. So access to data you shouldn't be able to access, or functionalities you shouldn't be accessing.
Okay, thank you, Jim. So obviously we've given some detail around some common findings, but there are other stuff that there's a few on here, but there might be a couple just worth mentioning.
Yeah, so we obviously try to make a top 10, and obviously not everything could go in the top, but there are some other common vulnerabilities that we identify during our different types of tests. Another that we identify often during internal tests is the IPv6 DNS poisoning and DNS takeover, which is very similar in terms of concept to the LLMNR and NBT-NS issue. It basically allows you to man in the middle, grab credentials, relay them. But we also do a lot of things, other different types of tests, like Wi-Fi testing, social engineering attacks, and we get a lot of common issues like using weak passwords for corporate Wi-Fi's, or employees being susceptible to social engineering attacks, credentials being found in public leaks that sometimes also give access to certain systems. So, and yeah, especially on the internal, we get some, a lot of the time we get some insufficient network segmentation, which obviously again goes again into the what we talked about, attack surface management. If you don't segment your network in different areas and you get access to every host in your network, obviously your attack surface is wider and you have more issues.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks, Jen. A few things to look out for. I know the network segmentation stuff is really important as well with the PCI framework, isn't it? Yeah. Okay, so so the next couple of slides, obviously we've talked about the vulnerabilities, the risks they pose. The next couple of slides we run through some mitigations, I suppose, to those vulnerabilities that you can take on board, and it will hopefully improve your cybersecurity.
Yeah, so I guess very generic, which can be the first thing. It's not really about cybersecurity, but it can be it can be a useful thing also from a finance perspective, from an operation perspective, is having an asset register. Because from a security perspective, if you don't know what you have, it's more difficult to protect it. And when you have that, if you attach also like an asset criticality, defining if it's mission critical, business critical, or business operational, it helps you also define a priority for any fixes. And in terms of patching, as you said, that's one of the biggest issues. So having a good patch management process and procedure, and having clear SLAs and roles and responsibilities helps with the patching issues.
I think before today, with the asset range, I was probably quite ignorant, and I always assumed it was laptops, and physical stuff, overlooking the JavaScript libraries and all that. So it'd be good to include that on that as well.
Yeah. So other general mitigations that we can recommend is obviously encryptions, both on the devices itself, but also on the communication. So in 2024, you should be able to disable any unencrypted protocols that you use for communication, because there is always a encrypted alternative, even for internal network. So it doesn't mean that if you're in an internal network, you're safe from traffic interception from malicious entities. Minimizing attack surface, as you said, and network segmentation is definitely one way of doing that. Enforcing SMB signing and disabling legacy protocols, and having antivirus solutions helps with a lot of other issues as well.
Brilliant. And then I think this is the last slide for the mitigation advice.
Yeah, so as you said, we have a lot of default weak passwords, and requiring authentication for everything, and setting strong passwords will definitely help, but definitely enforce MFA where possible to complement a strong password policy. Input validation and output sanitization, that's going to help with all the injections attacks, and also with the file uploads issues. And access control, having a clear matrix of who should be able to access which resources, and a centralized mechanism to manage that is going to help implement and test those mechanisms work as they should.
Thanks, Jim. There's some really good bits there. I notice, looking through those mitigations, are most of those covered with frameworks and certifications like Cyber Essentials, Cyber Essentials Plus, ISO 27 as well? I'm seeing like assets and seeing some overlap there.
Yeah, well, definitely those certifications give a good, so for example, certification like the ISO 27001, they give you a good framework where all this can be integrated. But obviously, those high-level frameworks give you structures and a strategy and a framework to work on, but don't always go into the details on how to implement those. And for example, especially when we're talking about technical controls, they don't really give you any specific guidance. Cyber Essentials has a more technical side of it with the Cyber Essentials Plus, because it gives a little bit more, but then again, it doesn't cover everything. So yes, they are very helpful and useful, and they help you give an overall idea of your directions in terms of security. But yeah, they wouldn't probably cover everything, especially, for example, in the website side of things. Some standards, let's say, that you can, or frameworks that you can follow are, for example, coming from the OWASP, which I believe stands for Open Worldwide Application Security Project. And they are kind of the de facto reference for application security, and they provide guidance and cheat sheets as well to protect against a lot of web application attacks and vulnerabilities.
Okay, so that'll go more into the tech, the development side of the security.
Yeah, which are typically not covered by other certification frameworks. Yeah.
Brilliant. Okay, thanks, Jim. It's really helpful. Okay, so our next slide, we're going to talk about the roles of vulnerability scanning. However, before we go into that, I speak to a lot of different clients and people, and often get asked about vulnerability scanning versus pen testing. Now, Jim, please correct me. So in my mind, vulnerability scanning is, you've got your house, and a vulnerability scan will say, oh, that window's open, that door's unlocked. Whereas a pen test will find out that information and then jump in the house and wreak havoc, on your property. Is that the right sort of thing at a very high level?
I guess, yeah, it gives a good idea, but I would say probably rather than wreak havoc would be would be assessing the impact that somebody could have by entering your house. So basically, if you see an open window, you could say, okay, that's a vulnerability, and you could get into the house. The penetration test would go into the house, look at inside what you have, if you have valuables, estimate the value of the necklace you have. So is how much impact is going to cause that if you exploit the open window. So
okay. It's not far off then.
No, yeah, no, it was I think it's a very good way to abstract from the technicalities and give an idea.
Brilliant, thanks, John. So yeah, can you give us more of an insight? Where does vulnerability scanning come into pen testing?
Yeah, so overall, vulnerability scanning is a very useful thing to do, and vulnerability scanners are very useful tools to quickly identify vulnerabilities and misconfiguration in your IT assets, because they're automated, so they don't need human supervision. They can be run unauthenticated, but also authenticated. They can cover infrastructure, but also web applications. So they're very useful in identifying vulnerabilities before threat actors can identify them and exploit them. And they're very useful to support penetration testing as well.
And would so vulnerability scanning, would that go way back to, I think, one of our first vulnerabilities, the out of support software and libraries? Would this, running a vulnerability scan, would this pick that up?
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
So that's how you can, one of the way you can discover all your patching issues as well, because vulnerability scanners are very good at, for example, enumerating the versions, especially if you give credentials to the scanners and allow them to run authenticated. They're going to be able to, for example, if you're in a Windows environment, to query your registries, check the versions of the software you've installed. So they're going to be able to quickly identify these issues in a very cost-effective way.
Thanks, Jim.
So yeah, so we definitely recommend running vulnerability scanning regularly, and as regularly as you can manage. Obviously, there's no point in running it daily if you're going to be ignoring the results. But running them regularly will give you the ability to identify if a new vulnerability is present sooner rather than later. And we recommend running them both authenticated and unauthenticated, because they're going to give you different views of network vulnerabilities or potential configuration changes or misconfiguration that you can have, and to run them on the range of IPs you have, so that if anything pops up, that somebody deploys something and you weren't aware of it, you're going to see that sooner rather than later. And obviously to integrate those results with your vulnerability management program if you have one, because obviously you have to act on those vulnerabilities, right?
I think obviously on this slide as well, we've listed the pros and the cons there. One of the cons there is the potential false sense of security. Can you elaborate on that one a little bit more?
Yeah, so sometimes it's easy for organizations to say, if the vulnerability scanner says it's critical or high, I'll fix it. If it's medium or low, I'll ignore that or I'll do it later. And that can give you a false sense of security, because if you have several medium or low severity findings that can be chained together, sometimes they can cause a higher impact and potentially critical impact on your organization. So having resolved only the direct the vulnerability that causes a direct high severity doesn't always mean that you have reduced the risks within your organization. So that's why we say that it can cause a false sense of security, because you may think that, oh, having those medium and low severity should be fine because we accept those, but actually they could cause more business impact if you chain certain things together.
Which I suppose a pen test would do and a hacker would do as well.
Yeah, exactly. So a pen test or an attacker would be able to link those together and analyze the impact. A vulnerability scanner typically is not able to do that.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you, Jim. Okay, so we're going to now talk about things to avoid, really, when you're having a pen test done. So John, I'll hand over to you on this one.
Yeah, so I think one of the main things is not to use the pen testing as a vulnerability identification tool, or at least not the only vulnerability identification tool. So if you wait, because obviously you're not, typically organizations are not going to run a pen test every month or every week, because they come with a cost. And if you run pen test only, for example, once a year, which is a quite common frequency within organizations, you're gonna wait a year before a vulnerability is identified. So use vulnerability scanners for that.
One I think we take very seriously, one of the points on this slide here is the incorrect scoping. What could go wrong if?
Yeah, so sometimes companies would want to exclude certain system from the scope because they're either, too risky in terms of availability. They don't want that to, go down during a test, or they want to exclude that because, different reasons. It can be availability. It can be because it contains data that you don't want third parties to access. It can be because you can't get approval from a third party, etc. So, or because you think that a certain functionality in a web application doesn't need testing because you don't deem that a security a threat for your security. So also sometimes you exclude, for example, you test a web application, but you exclude the platform hosting the web application or other, let's say, entry points, because sometimes you just don't consider them, right? So if you host something on a cloud environment, you may not think that, well, if you get access to that cloud environment, not via the application, but through like the admin console or the AWS portal, you can still compromise the data hosted by the application. So correctly scoping your security assessment is not always easy, and sometimes it's a budget decision. Sometimes it's just difficulty in scoping as well.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Okay, another one we get here is providing access to pen testers. So I know we ask for access or allow listed on certain scanners and firewalls and things like that, and everyone says, wait a minute, you're supposed to be coming at us. So what benefit is it for you having access?
Yeah, so sometimes we often ask to be allow listed against active protection mechanism, not because we want to make our life easier and to say how we hack you, but because we have a limited amount of time to perform the test typically. So we don't have the whole year or months to slowly enumerate our targets. We have limited days, and we want to maximize the test that we can perform against your assets in the limited time we have. So if you get blocked by a WAF, like web application firewall, or a intrusion prevention system saying, oh, your IP has been blocked for an hour, you're not gonna get as a client the maximum, the most out of the test, because we're gonna have to wait the time, and you're gonna get less tested in the same time, right? And in terms of credentials, sometimes we provide services like build reviews, and we need to be on the systems to query the configurations and to obtain the data to say, well, this is configured in a way that could be improved, and if you don't give us the credentials, we're not going to be able to access that in the time we have.
Okay, thanks, Jim. And is that typical practice? Is it? I'll move on to the next slide, but just is that typical practice, with pen testing organizations?
Yeah, I mean, it obviously there are different approaches you can take. You can take a much more black box approach and say, I'm not gonna disable any protection for you. I want to test my WAF, and that's fine, that's acceptable. But again, if you're not managing the WAF, if it's not something you develop and you want to test your application, for example, you probably are spending your money to test someone else's solution rather than your application. So, and that's typically not what our clients in the end want.
Yeah. Makes sense. I think that's where the scoping comes in as well, isn't
Yeah.
it, really? Okay, so yeah, some further pitfalls to avoid with pen testing.
Yeah, so I guess another one probably worth pointing out is the over reliance on automated tools. There's a lot of sometimes confusion with regard to what's the difference between a vulnerability scan or an automated pen test, and why is it different from a manual test. So automation is obviously very good. It helps with efficiency, and there are things that machines are probably better than humans in doing. But obviously, you can't only rely on automation and automated tools, especially because tools typically don't have a concept of the context. So for example, if a web application allows you access to resource 1, how does an automated tool know that you are supposed to access resource number 1 and not number 2, right? Because a human is able to say, well, because 1 is related to account A and I'm user B, so I shouldn't be able to access account A's data. But tools may struggle to get that type of context. Other things are obviously failure to obtain proper authorization, because we are doing everything in a legal way. We need to have the authorization from anyone that hosts the services, or that is responsible for the services. Inadequate reporting. If you do a pen test but the report doesn't tell you how to reproduce the vulnerability, doesn't give you actionable results, recommendation how to fix those, it's going to be not very useful for you to then have done the pen test, because the whole purpose of the test is then for you to be able to fix those vulnerabilities, right? And yes, as we mentioned, like blocking, having active protection mechanism, blocking the test, it's not going to be helpful in identifying as much issues, because yes, the aim of the test is obviously to identify those for you to be able to fix those.
Brilliant. And they should be fixed. Say the failure to follow up on identified vulnerabilities. I wouldn't imagine that one's on there, but yeah, it's there. Hey, brilliant. Thank you, Jun. And so I think the last sort of section of the presentation is around the practical things that you can do to support your cybersecurity and your pen testing program. So if we run through a few of these, Jim.
Yeah. So I guess at a very high level is, once you have performed like a penetration test or a security assessment, you can't always fix everything immediately, right? So you need to prioritize based on your business requirements, and obviously the best way to do that is to our recommendation is to do it with a risk-based approach and integrating that with your existing risk management framework. So identify what is most critical for you and focus on those first. But obviously, in a more technical and practical things that you can do today, based on what we talked about during the webinar, is obviously, when you have authentication, set strong password and always enforce MFA. Use password managers to help with that, and reduce the attack surface. If you don't have to expose some interfaces like login interfaces, don't. Hide them from the internet, hide them from the wider internal corporate network, make them accessible only from specific management networks. Disable legacy protocols, vulnerable protocols, enforce SMB signing. As we said, run regular vulnerability scans, both authenticated and unauthenticated. And if you don't have the capacity or the skills to do that in-house, you can ask external provider to do those, such as URM. Most of the pen testing and vulnerability assessment providers are able to help you with that. Have assets register, have a patch management solution in place, but also have a process around that so that you can set clear deadlines, service level agreements, like when a critical vulnerability needs to be fixed, say within 3 days, within 5 days a high, within 30 days, 14 days a medium, and then have clear roles and responsibility of who does what, so that things get done, rather than being left there and not fixed. And if you obviously develop application following secure code development practices and referring to the OWASP, as we said, it's a very good recommendation.
Brilliant. There's some constants, throughout the presentation there. So I think the asset register is a constant as a benefit. Patch management, again, equally important. So yeah, some things that can be done within the business to really help the cybersecurity. Fantastic. Thank you very much, Jim.
Thank you. Excellent.
So yeah, we've got time for probably a question or two. So one that came in actually was around, came in just after the pitfall slides when you're talking about the reporting. What should you expect in a pen test report from your supplier?
So I would say at a high level, there are two things you should expect. One is an executive summary that talks to not only technical people, but to the decision makers in your company, which may not understand technical terms. So you should be able to have some descriptions of what issues were found, what's the business impact, and why you should fix them, and how to fix them at a high level, from a high level perspective, without using too much technicalities. Then you should have a technical part, because obviously your technical team will then need to fix those. And good things to look for in the reports are there enough information to reproduce the issues, because technical teams will want to try to reproduce it to understand how the vulnerability works, and then recommendations that help you remediate, so that are actionable and that can really be used to actually guide you into resolving the issues.
Brilliant, thank you. So it needs to be some level of detail in there, doesn't it, really, by the sounds of it?
Yeah, definitely. Detail. In all reports, we try to put as much information as possible with regards to how to reproduce the issues. You know, if you need to run some command, what commands to run, or what steps to follow to replicate, and how to remediate those.
Brilliant. Thank you, Jim. So I'm conscious of time. So if you've got any other questions, please pop them on your feedback form, and we will, we'll reach out to you to discuss them and address those questions. You may even be lucky enough to get Jim on a call with you potentially. So just before we finish there, so how can URM help? Obviously, we can run pen tests, and with our pen test, we've also got an offer on there for external, internal, and web app. If you require any other cloud reviews, any other services like that, again, please put it on your feedback form, and we can always set up a call to discuss. And as part of URM's standard sort of pen test offering, we offer free retest of critical and high severity vulnerabilities, typically within a 30-day window, just because it's good practice to, if you find a high, you know, typically you want to patch that quite quickly to keep your security levels up. But that comes with all of our pen tests. So again, you know, please just let us know if you want to call. Future events, so please keep an eye on your inbox, because you should get an invite to our next webinar, which is on the 17th of July. And on that webinar, we're going to be talking about improving your supplier risk management, which is getting more and more important with supply chains. So yeah, please keep an eye out for that. And can I ask you kindly to complete your feedback form? So we base our events off your feedback. We want to meet your requirements and see you in future events. So if you've got any feedback for us, please leave that on the form. And lastly, from Jill and I, thank you very much for attending today and spending the time with us, and have a good rest of your day.
Thank you very much, everyone.